Welcome to 90 Minutes with Neville Southall, a podcast about giving a voice to people whose voices are often not heard. In this episode, we'll be talking about the menopause, something that more than half the population will go through, often suffering due to lack of understanding of the symptoms, lack of support in work, and maybe being seen by GPs who perhaps have had minimum menopause education. I'm James Rogers, and I'm here with the big man himself, Neville Southall, as well as Mel Harvey from our podcast team, who'll be guiding today's discussion. But before we meet our guests, I'd like to ask Mel about why this topic is so important to her and what she hopes to achieve from today's discussion.
Hi everyone, I was so delighted when Neville asked me to join this podcast group to talk about issues that really matter to us and to try and shine a light on issues that exist in society. I was the first woman that was asked to be included, so I was thrilled about that. So obviously I insisted that we got down to some really good topics that really mattered to women, and particularly women of my age. I feel as a woman, I turned 50 this year, and I feel sometimes you feel a little bit invisible in life, and as though people are starting to view you as though, oh, well, she's nearly 50, what point are they anymore? I do feel like the tide is changing a bit, but I think that the menopause is something that we never used to talk about. You know, people of my mum's generation would say, well, we just got on with it. You know, I don't know what everyone's moaning about, at the same time as them suffering absolutely dreadful, debilitating symptoms. People talk about hot flushes. It's so much more than that. And I also think we need to talk a little bit more about the perimenopause, which is the period that comes before the menopause that women go through. And some of the symptoms during that time are really, really terrifying. So I really appreciate Neville giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate our guests joining us today.
But thanks so much, Mel. Thanks for teeing us up so well there. So I'll just, on the subject of the guests, so today, on today's episode, we're going to be speaking to Jenny Griffin, Project Manager for Unison Wales Union Learning Fund, also known as WOLF. Now, Jenny spent a lot of time working directly with the women's group, supporting and campaigning around the various issues affecting women, most notably the menopause. Jenny's utilised the Welsh Government-funded WOLF project to deliver sessions across Wales, raising awareness for employees and managers around this key issue. Our first guest, though, is Diane Danzebrink, who founded Menopause Support, a not-for-profit community interest company and home to the Make Menopause Matter campaign. Diane became acutely aware of the woeful lack of education and information about menopause for both the public and healthcare practitioners as a result of her own dreadful experience following surgery, which put her into surgical menopause. So Diane, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So Diane, I wonder if we could just kind of go right back to the beginning with you, to take us right back to the beginning of your story and your experiences that brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So it's actually going back quite a while now. We're going back to 2012. And in 2012, I had to have surgery to remove both of my ovaries, my womb and my cervix. That was because it was thought that I had ovarian cancer. I also had very severe endometriosis and a condition called adenomyosis. And whilst the surgery was certainly the right thing to do, and I knew that I would not be having any more periods, nobody took the time to sit down with me before the surgery and counsel me about going straight into this place of surgical menopause. And in fact, even when I left the hospital 2 days after my surgery, the only thing that I was told was to see how I got on, and then in a few weeks' time to make an appointment to go and see my GP. So I had no clue about the many and varied symptoms of menopause. And I had no idea about the factual evidence-based information around treatments that could help to manage any symptoms that I might experience. So I had my surgery, went home, sat on the sofa, watched the Olympics for a couple of weeks, which was brilliant timing, and then sort of started to very gently get back into looking after myself as best I could, you know, sort of good eating, very, very, very gentle exercise, etc. And actually thought this is going pretty well in the first few weeks. And then all of a sudden, things started to change quite dramatically. And it wasn't with my physical health, but it was with my mental health. So the only thing that I had ever heard about hormone replacement therapy was pretty much all the scary stuff from the past 20 years in newspaper headlines. And that had completely put me off. And of course, nobody had taken the time to bring me up to date. So I had no idea that things were different. And so I took myself off to see a nutritionist. She gave me lots and lots of different herbal supplements. It was only later, once I became a lot more educated, that I realized that somebody who'd gone into an early surgical menopause, that was just really not going to do the job for me. And so as a result, my mental health started to deteriorate. I became incredibly anxious, increasingly agoraphobic, wouldn't leave the house. My panic attacks started. My husband was becoming increasingly concerned about my state of mind, to the point where he actually asked my mum to come and stay with me during the daytime. I couldn't work at all. I'd had to stop work. So I was working for myself, ran 2 small businesses, had to stop work altogether. So obviously that was the added pressure financially too. Would go to bed at night, lay there, finally drop off to sleep, wake back up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, felt as though somebody was sitting on my chest. And quite often I would end up kind of tiptoeing out of the room to where my mum was sleeping and go and sob on her because of how I felt my life was going. Each day just felt darker than the last. And they desperately tried to persuade me to go back to see the GP, but I was terrified of going back because I thought it would either be a lifetime of antidepressants, or because I really felt that I was going mad, I thought it could potentially be admittance to a mental health unit. This went on for longer than it should have done because I was so resistant to going and seeing a doctor. And long story short, got to the point where on one particular day, I came incredibly close to putting my car in front of a lorry. The only thing that stopped me was I was incredibly fortunate that I had my dogs in the car. And at the very point of me making the maneuver, one of those little dogs started to bark. And I think I say thank you every single day of my life to Henry, who was the little dog. I don't really know how I got home, but I explained to my husband what I'd almost done. And unbeknown to me, he actually contacted the doctors and essentially said, "You have got to see her today." And when I sat down in front of a GP, she explained to me how my body had essentially gone into a state of sort of estrogen deprivation, because we produce most of the estrogen from our ovaries. Mine had been removed. Nobody had talked to me about why the estrogen should be replaced. She thankfully understood completely what was going on. I told her how scared I was about the idea of HRT. She told me how things had changed over the last 20 years, gave me all the latest factual evidence-based information, explained to me how the benefits for me significantly outweighed any very, very minimal risk. I started on these little sticky patches the next day. Within a couple of weeks, the world didn't seem to be quite such a dark, hopeless place anymore. And things improved. And then I got really angry because I started to wonder if I was the only person that this had happened to. And I did what we all do. I turned to the internet, started to research, and found far too many stories on there of people saying, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't feel like me anymore. I feel like I'm going mad. I feel like I'm so alone. And I remember turning to my husband one day and saying, this simply cannot go on. We're half the population. How the hell has this been allowed to happen? If I ever feel like me again, I'm going to make damn sure I do something to change it. And that's how menopause support and the Make Menopause Matter came about.
Do you feel lucky? It's interesting when you mentioned the GP that you went to see. Do you feel lucky that you got a good GP? Because I personally, my story is completely different from yours. You know, I don't have as severe symptoms as you, but I feel like the first time I tried to discuss this with a GP, I was just dismissed. Do you feel, how lucky do you feel that that GP that you saw at that moment was so knowledgeable? Because that's quite rare.
Yeah, I feel incredibly lucky. I mean, as it turns out, that was the GP in the practice who was the women's health lead. So I feel incredibly lucky, and particularly now, having learnt so much about it over the last few years, and knowing that a lot of GPs have never had any formal menopause training. I mean, last year, Menopause Support did a Freedom of Information request to all of the UK medical schools to ask them what they taught to undergraduate medical students. And it turned out that 41% of those medical schools said they taught no mandatory menopause education. Now, the route to GP is quite a long one. Obviously, you do the initial training at medical school. Then there is another set of exams, another set of study that makes you a GP. But even in the Royal College of GPs curriculum, although menopause is on the curriculum, it's not a mandatory module. It's an elective self-study module. So for me, I can never get my head around the fact that the first port of call for pretty much everybody is going to be their GP. So surely it's just common sense that we equip all our GPs with the right education and information. Because to be fair to the GPs, you know, if you're not being taught what you need to know, that's as unfair to the GP as it is to the patient. But it's also costing the NHS a fortune, because I speak to women regularly who tell me they go back to see the GP 5, 6, 7, 8 times. We know how hard it is to get a GP appointment. We know, you know, sort of how under pressure GPs are. So that's just madness. That's just wasted NHS time. We know that women are referred for things like palpitations, they go to cardiology, achy joints, they go to rheumatology. The one that scares me the most is when I speak to women who are struggling with their mental health and they're sent off to psychiatry. Again, those referrals all cost money, but most importantly, this is costing health and well-being for individuals, and then the knock-on effect it has to their families and their work, etc. So I don't think there's any point raising a problem or an issue unless you're prepared to say, okay, this is the potential solution. And the tragic thing for me is that so many of the solutions to these issues are so simple. All it needs is for the stakeholders that can make the difference to sit round a table, agree a strategy and get on and do it. But I started raising awareness about this back in 2015. It was a really lonely place at the time because nobody really wanted to talk about menopause. Thankfully, we're in a very different position. We've got celebrities, we've got medical health professionals, we've got MPs all talking about it. But, you know, talk is not going to make the difference. What we need is action.
It's interesting when you talk about those wasted resources. So in the last 5 years, I've been referred to a cardiologist for heart palpitations. I've seen a specialist physiotherapist for vertigo. And they're just two, and I've had various appointments along the line to get to that point where I've seen both of those people. At no point did my GP ever say, this could be the menopause. I actually raised it with a GP and said, these symptoms I'm having, various different things. Do you not think the vertigo and the heart palpitations could be linked? Do you think they could be? And the first question was, do you still have periods? And I was like, well, every now and again, but they're not normal. You know, I know I'm not ovulating. I just know that. Well, let's do a smear test. What's that got to do with anything else? And it's just terrifying. The lack of knowledge is absolutely terrifying. And it's only now, I think I sat down about 2 months ago and thought, the palpitations, the vertigo, they must be linked. But as you say, it's so difficult to get an appointment. It's so difficult to get an appointment with the women's health lead in your GP surgery. I'm probably one of those people who's guilty of saying, let's not bother the GPs during COVID. So I think we're all a little bit, well, we blame ourselves, don't we? We blame ourselves. I heard you say it when you were talking earlier, you blamed yourself for not going back to your GP, but nobody told you you were going to experience those symptoms.
No, absolutely lovely. And I think the thing is, you know, because my thinking by that time was so irrational, and because I was so, you know, I'm the I'm the type of person, so not only sort of professionally do I help and support other people, but in my private life, I'm the friend that other friends come to. I'm the friend that is the voice of reason. I'm the friend that can always kind of be calm, collected. Okay, let's look at what the options are. Let's help you find a solution to this problem. I was so far from that person, there was no way that I just could not form a rational thought. And I genuinely thought that I was going mad. And it was really scary. And I so understand when people say to me now, you know, once you have got the right help and support, that's fine. But when you're in the eye of the storm, it's so difficult. And, you know, I don't think that's just for menopause either. I think that's with any kind of mental health issue that you're struggling with. And I think it's one of those things that unless you've experienced it, you really don't understand what it feels like. But I so get what you mean about us blaming ourselves. And I think a lot of us do recognize that, you know, our GPs are under huge pressure. In the last couple of years, that pressure has been exacerbated. But I still come back to the fact that, you know, 51% of the population are going to experience perimenopause and menopause. So consequently, to serve everybody, you know, those going through it directly, those around them, our GPs, the NHS, wider society, let's get the right education and information out there, because that will help everybody. And it's not expensive to do.
I know it might be a silly question, but there's two things, or three things. I don't understand what estrogen does to your body. So what would you replace that with? Mm-hmm. The other thing is there an age where you start a menopause, or is it just, can it be any age? And really, I suppose, you know when you go to a GP and you're over 60 as a man, then there's certain you look for. Do they do the same things with women? So the menopause should come under an age group, or doesn't it have an age group?
Okay, so for the vast majority, perimenopause, so peri means around the time of, so around the time of menopause, perimenopause, often the symptoms often start around the early to mid 40s. So doctors who specialize in menopause would expect the vast majority to be experiencing perimenopausal symptoms by the time they're 45. That kind of leads on to your third question, and that is that we have NICE guidance in the UK, and NICE guidance tells medical professionals that they should not be offering a blood test to diagnose menopause or perimenopause to women over the age of 45. And that's partly because we expect most people to be perimenopausal by the time they're 45. And secondly, when estrogen starts to fluctuate sort of quite erratically, as it can do in that perimenopause into postmenopause phase, because it goes up and down on a daily basis, sometimes an hourly basis, doing a blood test is simply a snapshot in time. So you could have a woman with a host of symptoms who has a blood test, and then the GP says, oh no, it's normal. Well, the blood test might say it's normal, but a few hours later, it might say differently. And again, a few hours. So perimenopause should really be diagnosed on symptoms alone. Having said most people will experience it early to mid 40s, it's also important to say that 1 in 100 will experience menopause under the age of 40, 1 in 1,000 under 30, and 1 in 10,000 under 20. So the youngest woman I've ever supported is 17, but we do know of a girl of around 12 who's experienced it. So it's really rare, but 1 in 100 under 40 is not so rare. And it's also important to remember that whilst the vast majority who go through perimenopause into postmenopause will be women, it's also important to remember that it can affect transgender men and non-binary friends and colleagues as well. So there's that to take into account. So estrogen is a key hormone, and it has lots of different functions. And we have estrogen receptors from the top of our heads to the tip of our toes. So estrogen acts as a lubricant for the body. It acts as a nourisher for the body. So it does things like lubricates the eyes, the mouth, the entire gut process, keeps the entire kind of pelvic area healthy, helps to stabilize sort of the internal thermostat. So everybody's heard of hot flashes and night sweats. So when estrogen starts to fluctuate, that's when those hot flashes and night sweats happen. Helps to keep our bones healthy, our hearts healthy. We're learning more and more about how it keeps the brain healthy. So consequently, Nev, when the hormone starts to fluctuate, so during perimenopause, what happens is progesterone levels fall, estrogen starts to fluctuate. When estrogen starts to fluctuate, because we've got those hormone receptors all over the body, the symptoms can be really varied. So 1 in 4 will experience very few symptoms. 3 out of 4 will experience symptoms, and 1 in 4 will call those symptoms debilitating. So severely affecting quality of life in some way, shape, or form. And as far as what you can do once those symptoms come along, hormone replacement therapy, so that's what's called the first line treatment for menopause. That consists of, if you're somebody who has their womb, that consists of estrogen and progesterone together. So basically you're giving small doses back to help to ease those symptoms. And if it's somebody who's had their womb removed, they don't need to have progesterone too. They can just have estrogen replacement. So basically, it's about giving a little bit of something back to help to calm those symptoms down, at least until somebody sort of has come to a place where they are postmenopausal. So postmenopausal clinically means that you've had 12 months without a period. Now, for somebody like me, who had her ovaries and her womb removed at the age of 45, I probably was perimenopausal, I didn't know it, but I went from perimenopausal to postmenopausal overnight. So it's kind of everything. Whereas for somebody in what we would class as a natural menopause, their symptoms might start in their early to mid 40s. And on average, most women are postmenopausal by the time they're around 52. Can happen a little bit later, but that's a sort of a rough guide.
Right, so my other 2 questions would be, is sportswomen who take tablets to suppress periods would be one. what happens to them, and the other one would be, is there anything that would, what's the word I'm looking for, is, make you more susceptible to having menopause than not? I'm thinking about other hormone things and things that, maybe other illnesses.
Yeah, so as far as women who suppress their periods, they're probably using something like the combined contraceptive pill. It depends how long they use it. So if you're using the combined, so sports women, I'm kind of in my head when you say sports women, I'm really thinking, I don't know why, but I think athletes for some reason. I don't know why that is. So if they're using them in their, let's say, 20s and 30s, if they continue to use the combined contraceptive, perhaps well into their 40s. I mean, the kind of national guidance is for women over 50 not to be using combined contraceptive, to be swapping to something else. But if they are using it sort of well into their 40s, perhaps up until the time, perhaps they're 50, we know that the combined contraceptive pill can, to some extent, suppress some of those menopausal symptoms. But if they're only using it in their 20s and 30s, and then maybe they go on, sort of either to try for a family or they use a different form of contraception, that shouldn't have an effect. Sorry, what was the second question?
Is there anything that makes you more susceptible?
Yeah. Okay. So anything. So we know that if somebody has experienced severe PMS, so severe premenstrual syndrome, so that time coming up to their period, so we call that the luteal phase, coming up to your period. If somebody has experienced that through their lives, or in fact a condition called PMDD. So PMDD is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and that can be incredibly challenging. So that is when somebody has a very, very severe reaction to their own naturally fluctuating hormone levels on a monthly basis. If somebody suffered with PMS or PMDD, or if somebody has something like ADHD, people with autism, people who perhaps have experienced postnatal depression, we know that menopause can exacerbate, that can be worse for some of those people. Now, it's not fair to say that that is blanket across the board. But we know that, so again, it's about education. It's about saying to people who have a past medical history, okay, we need to look at. So we also know that women with Down syndrome, we know that they tend to go into an earlier menopause. So again, that's really important information. So there's, kind of, that's a really generalized overview of some of the things. But I also just want to say, lovely, that there are no silly questions, because it's like, it would be like me talking about football. If I was talking to you about football, all my questions would be silly because I know nothing about it. But that's because I've never been educated about it. And I think this is the thing. What's brilliant about today is, for somebody like yourself opening this conversation up, hopefully we're going to touch a lot of people who might never have even considered menopause, but they will ultimately know somebody in their lifetime who goes through it.
Right, so I'm gonna upset you now then. Right. Why is it the fellas just say, oh, yeah, but you're always grumpy when you have a period or you got menopause? You're always grumpy. Is it factual based on your hormones, obviously? Is there something in your hormones that makes you more grumpy? Is it the fact that you have all that stuff going on in your body? That obviously, I'd be worn out. I'm worn out just listening to it, because I'm thinking half of them symptoms look like COVID to me as well. So in this time and day, how would you know you got menopause, you got COVID? Yeah.
So I think, is it what, kind of about, so you won't upset me. People will have said much worse things in the past. And I think, I think because none of us learn anything about this in the classroom. So, I'm absolutely thrilled that thanks to all the thousands and thousands of people that have signed the Make Menopause Matter campaign petition, and thanks to a couple of MPs who really have supported us in Parliament, we've actually managed to make sure that menopause is now on the curriculum in England, which is amazing. But, if we don't all grow up understanding the power of hormones, and I think when we look back in our lives, we do know the power of hormones, but nobody teaches us about them. So, that fluctuation on a monthly basis, those hormone changes, they don't start in the ovaries, they start in the brain. And so consequently, if you are somebody who's unfortunate enough to suffer with what's commonly called PMS or PMT, and if you know that that's coming every month, then actually that's not really something to look forward to. So yeah, you probably are going to be a bit grumpy about it. And actually you can't help it, because it's the hormones fluctuating and changing that makes you feel like that. The most important thing, I think, is that, particularly if you have a male partner, or you have children who are of an age to understand, that hopefully they'll all grow up knowing this in the future, but that we try to share this information so that people get that, I'm not just being grumpy once a month. Actually, this is really quite tough. And of course, there are things that you can potentially do to help, obviously, depending on sort of A, whether you want to, and B, how severe the issues are. But yeah, there's no doubt that it can be challenging, but I think with education and information, things could be better.
So you talk about, we've just listened to you, and you have got a huge wealth of knowledge. I mean, it's not just the menopause. God, I can't even believe I just said that. It's the whole reproductive system and people's health and mental health. So from the point where you got angry, did you know any of that? Have you learned all that stuff since? You talked about that moment you got really angry and said, I don't want this to happen to other people. Was it then a case of a huge amount of research? Because your depth of knowledge is incredible.
Yeah, I have, lovely. So it has been sort of pretty much since about sort of the mid 2013, I have eaten, slept, drunk, breathed menopause and mental health. And obviously, if you know about, so mental health is not something that you can think about without thinking about hormones, because hormones have an effect on mental health. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So you have to know, you have to understand both. You have to see it in a holistic way, if you like. But we also know that there are other things that, we have to look at this, if you like, in a biopsychosocial way. The way that menopause is viewed, how menopause affects an individual, the way that it makes somebody feel. But then once you start to learn some about hormones, then it makes sense that you understand what happens before menopause comes along. Once menopause has you've been through that perimenopausal into postmenopausal stage. So for me, initially, I went back to studying. So many years before I had studied counselling, I went back to study counselling and coaching again, did some trauma training, went and did some menopause professional training in menopause, nurse training in menopause. But yeah, it's what I do. It's what I study. I'm fascinated by the whole thing. And I think you have to have a rounded knowledge, particularly if you're going to be not so much for things like campaigning, but if you're going to be supporting individuals, which is a lot of what we do, you have to have a very rounded view and a rounded understanding. so yeah, it's been a you know, sort of, it's been a learning journey.
So the campaign, it's been fascinating over the last couple of years to see how the menopause is now talked about. You mentioned celebrities, Davina McCall, we've seen Penny Lancaster involved. What role have you played in that campaigning, and what role has your organisation played in that campaigning?
Yeah, so I launched the Make Menopause Matter campaign in October 2018, and I launched it in Westminster with the help of Carolyn Harris MP, who has gone on to set up this APPG, all-party parliamentary group in Parliament. And I launched it with 3 very clear aims. The first was to have mandatory menopause training for all our GPs. The second is to have guidance and support in every workplace. And the third is to have menopause included in the RSE curriculum in schools throughout the UK. Within 9 months, thanks to, as I say, support of MPs in Westminster, within 9 months, the Education Secretary had announced that he would add menopause to the curriculum in England. Obviously, we want to see that throughout the UK, and that actually came into force in September 2020. But of course, again, we have to think more widely. You know, teachers their time has been taken up thinking about how on earth am I going to teach all my students remotely? What are we going to do about COVID restrictions? So I think it's going to take a few years to filter through, but the most important thing for us is that it's there, because essentially that has changed history. You know, getting menopause on the curriculum in schools, that has been huge, and that's thanks to everybody that supported the campaign. As far as where we are now, I'm sure you'll be aware that October last year, we had a rally in Westminster. The rally was organised again by the APPG that Carolyn Harris had led. And that was to support the menopause bill that was going through Parliament. And that was she was asking for free HRT in England. The government didn't quite make it free. They said that it would be one single prescription charge annually for anybody who was using hormone replacement therapy. But at the same time, the minister who made that pledge is a minister called Maria Caulfield MP, and she's part of the Department of Health. She pledged that there would be a menopause task force, which would look at basically the key 3 aims of the campaign. So somebody once said to me, campaigning is a marathon, not a sprint. And it truly is. But, you know, we won't be going away anytime soon. And until things have improved, we will still continue to call for us to be the generation to make menopause matter. And I truly believe that with the amount of voices that are being raised now, I think that we can make that happen.
And finally, Diane, could you just let anyone who's listening or watching know a little bit more about the petition and your hashtag and social media, and how people can get involved and follow you for help and information, and also to help the campaigning that you're doing?
Yeah, of course. So our organisation is called Menopause Support. It's menopausesupport.co.uk. So if anybody is struggling, or you're looking for guidance or signposting, then, you know, please do come along and have a look. We've got lots of free resources on there that I'd be delighted if you would use them, print them, download them, share them, etc. We have a support group where we support around 26,000. We obviously also have the campaign. So the campaign is hashtag Make Menopause Matter, and you can find the link to the campaign on the website. And I would love you very much if you would sign it and share it.
We will indeed. We will indeed. Thank you so much, Diane.
My pleasure.
Diane, thank you so much for sharing that with us, and thank you for talking so candidly about your experiences. I would ask, could you stick around for a little bit, because
Of
we're going to have a bit of a
course.
discussion at the end. So we'll be hearing a bit more from Diane shortly. So just like to welcome our next guest now, Jenny Griffin, Project Manager for Unison Wales Union Learning Fund. So Jenny, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, James. Thank you for having me.
So we've spoken to Diane. We've heard a lot about symptoms at Diane's own very moving account of her personal experience. We're women. We're either going through it. We're going to go through it. And for me, one of the most disturbing things is the fact that there are women walking away from careers or being forced not to be able to go to work and earn money. That horrifies me. So obviously the work that you're doing is to try and help women in the workplace and also help their employers to get to a better place. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as Diane said earlier, Welsh women make up nearly half of the workforce. Unison has got 1.3 million members across the UK, and actually 70% of our membership are women. And I used to I've worked for Unison for 14 plus years, and I worked quite heavily with the women's group within Unison, so doing lots of kind of campaigning around equalities issues and helping to improve the rights of women at work. And one of the constant issues that kept coming up was around the menopause. And then actually in 2016, it was when I actually met Diane. The Wales TUC had, they wanted to put together a toolkit for the menopause, and actually had put together a survey to kind of back up what they thought were the issues. I think it was the largest survey response that they had. Nearly 4,000 people came back to them. And out of those 4,000 people, 88% of the people that responded said that the menopause affects their working life. 88%. And, you know, unfortunately, it's not like when we go to work, we can leave the menopause in the kitchen with the dogs. They come with us wherever we go. So, you know, it's a real issue within the workplace. So, you know, there was lots of anecdotal evidence in there about you know, making light of a situation, making jokes. And that's not just management, not just colleagues, but people themselves making jokes to try and make other people feel more comfortable around going through the menopause. About, you know, being unable to raise the issue of the menopause in the workplace, whether it be a male manager, but also female managers, because it's all down to perception and what people's experiences are. Either they've been through it or they know somebody else has been through it, and that's shaping how they respond to others. And a definite lack of understanding around the menopause. You know, there's lots of points that Diane was raising around early menopause. The training that I deliver, lots of people don't realise that actually how common 1 in 100 people experiencing menopause under the age of 40. People don't realise just how common that is. So this whole issue of, oh, don't be so ridiculous, you're too early to be going through the menopause. It's nonsense.
I mean, I know personally during perimenopause, I was very, very lucky to be working in the type of job where I could leave, I could say I'm not well, the world wouldn't stop if I wasn't there. And also I still got paid if I was off sick. And that's a really, really crucial point. You know, so many people just don't get paid if they go off sick. But there's been terrible experiences that I'm sure many women have experienced. When the first time I experienced a sort of flood period during the perimenopause, I thought I was having a miscarriage. I mean, clear, you know, it was that horrendous, and I was at work, and I thought, my God, I'm having a miscarriage, and I need to go home. I just can't be here. I wasn't. It was just my very first experience of that. But I was so lucky that I could say to my boss, I'm not well. Didn't tell him what it was. You know, it was, I'm not well. I've probably said, you know, I've got some sort of sickness bug. I need to go home. But I still got paid. But there'll be women who don't get paid if they don't go to work. And what can we do about that?
Yeah, and it's about having that conversation. First of all, being comfortable to have that conversation, and then knowing that conversation is going to come from a supportive place, not a sanctioned place. What can we do to support this person to keep them in work? Because let's be honest, if we don't keep these people in work, we're losing skilled, experienced staff. You know, it's for the individual. What changes can we do within the workplace to help support you? I mean, supporting people in the workplace, I always say it's not just the kind thing to do, it's not just the moral thing to do, but actually from an employer perspective, it's the legal thing to do. There are different elements of legislation that support people at work. You've got the Health and Safety at Work Act. That's the one that supports all of our health and well-being. And actually, it's that act that asks people to do risk assessments. And we all know we've heard about pregnancy risk assessments, or if somebody's returning to work after an accident, or if there's a disability, risk assessments are a general thing. When I run training, it's amazing the amount of people that I've never heard. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard of one person that come up to me. I think I've had one in the 3-4 years of delivering this training that have heard of gender risk assessments. And when you consider just how debilitating some of these symptoms can be for women in the workplace, the debilitating symptoms that last not just a couple of months, we're talking years. And actually under the Equalities Act, what was the Disability Discrimination Act, it's a 12-month adverse effect on our day-to-day lives, 12 months. Well, as Diane was saying earlier, between the ages of 44, 55, that's a long time. So actually, it's making sure that managers understand their obligations from a legal perspective, but doing what they can to keep those people in the workplace. And quite often, there are small adjustments that you can make. We know that everybody who works in an open office environment will all know there's always one person that's really, really hot, and there's always one person that's really, really cold. Well, if the person's really, really hot is sat next to the radiator, where can we, is there a desk swap? Can we provide them with a fan? Those are not massive cost implications. Could we, you might look more in depth, can we look at uniforms and the clothing that people wear? Can we consider, cotton fibers or bamboo fabrics for uniforms? Little things that can make a big difference. But the only way that happens is by having the conversation. It's being able to approach your manager to know that there's a supportive framework there, not a sanction framework. And the manager then think, okay, well, let's have this conversation, because no two people will experience the menopause the same. As Diane said, some people may have a few symptoms, they might get on with it fine. Some will be quite debilitating, but it not last long. No two people will ever be the same. And what a solution for one might not be the solution for the other. So having that open conversation.
Do you think those conversations have become more common now? Do you think what we've seen in the last couple of years, I read a lot about Kay Burley, the Sky News presenter, talking about having hot flushes on air. Do you think people like her just talking about this and just making it an everyday thing, let's just talk about it? Have you noticed a difference in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the training that I provide through the Wales Union Linen Fund project, the one challenge I issue to everybody when they come on the training is to have the conversation with somebody. And I don't just mean women, I mean men and all ages. It's having the conversation with everyone. My 10-year-old, he's had the conversation because I want him to be a supportive man growing up, to know how to support people.
I think you've answered it. I was just asking, have things improved as the conversation improved? Have the celebrity conversations and television programs, have they helped, do you think, in your experience?
Yeah, I definitely think we're making strides. I mean, we're definitely not there yet. I think a few of the things that I've noticed with the training that I provide, whereas 4 or 5 years ago, Diane mentioned about the perimenopause, that was not a term that most people were aware of. It wasn't, whereas flip 4 or 5 years and actually the majority of people have heard that. There are still few that haven't. So, we do still need to have that conversation. I find it interesting and what's the word I want? Encouraged that actually we've got more men coming on the training that I'm providing, because, yes, it's women that are experiencing the menopause, but actually the only way you make a change is by having everybody in on that conversation. And from a workplace perspective, workplace policies, workplace procedures, they weren't designed with menopausal women in mind because nobody was having the conversation. If nobody was having the conversation, how could they have been brought to mind? So there was an article, it was back last year, in August last year, in The Guardian, about the rise in the number of employment tribunal cases where women were taking employment tribunal cases on grounds of menopause. That's on the increase. And I see that as such an empowering thing now, that women are using their voice, they are challenging this. And I think it's that kind of information that's getting out there, the conversations that are happening, that they are making changes, but I think we've still got further to go.
Nev?
Yeah, you know, as a union rep, Jenny, I find it, I'm not sure whether women did approach me about the menopause, in all fairness. So how can I bridge that gap?
How to have the conversation?
Well, yeah.
I wouldn't suggest you just jumping straight in there.
You know, I can't really come in the staff room and have conversations. So, by the way, anybody having a menopause, I'm always here for a chat. So you know, because obviously it's not done like that. So I want to make people aware that I understand it, or have a better understanding of it now, but try and bridge that gap as a union rep. Well, there's 2 of us in there, and he's a welfare officer. How do we make it easier for the women to come to us, if you like?
I think it's about the kind of the environment that you create. So, you know, the training awareness that's out there. So making sure within an employer, certainly within the trade union movement, Unison has worked with many employers to provide that training. So it's all about the partnership approach between the employer and the union. And I think that's why unions have got such an important role to play, because it takes some of the onus away from the employer. This is a trade union led thing, and it's a partnership approach. It's about, you know, it's all fine and well, isn't it? How negotiating a policy. Unions, we're here to negotiate workplace policies, which are great. And, you know, it's great to have a menopause policy there. However, a policy is only as good as the paper it's written on and the actions that sit behind it. Actually, if you produce this wonderful policy that sits up on the shelf in the HR room that nobody knows exists and knows what's in there, then actually it's not worth the paper it's written on. The training, the awareness, running things like the Menopause Cafe. It's a really good kind of a resource. It's basically about creating a safe space now. So you're talking about how to have those conversations, bringing people together to share their experiences, and sometimes just giving people the opportunity to say the word menopause, to acknowledge what's happening for themselves as well, sharing experiences, sharing what works for them, because I think sometimes it's about sharing, well, this worked for me, why don't you try that? And I think we're much more likely to take it from our peers as well. So, you know, lots of different support mechanisms that back up that conversation. So when I'm saying about having the conversation, what else can we do to help support that?
Right, okay.
It sounds to... Sorry, Nev, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I've never been aware of a menopause policy in our place. I mean, we're a school, so it's nobody ever knows. So I suppose the only way I could start that conversation is by going asking the women if they've ever heard of the menopause policy. And if they've never heard of it, that's not very good, is it, in the building?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being part of a project in an employer, I won't say which one, where I'll be honest, the majority of the time I'm pushing against an open door when it comes to the menopause, because people are recognizing that actually there's so much benefit to not recognizing the menopause, that's not what I want, but kind of supporting, being an aware and a supportive employer. This one particular employer that we were working in, it was trade union led initiative, where the menopause was kind of recognized within the reps and within some of the staff members, but not necessarily being taken on board by management. And as reps, we do what we call mapping. Neville will know this. So you kind of look at your workforce and say, right, okay, what's our demographic? And in this particular employer, when you look at the male to female ratio, there was a really, really high proportion of female workers. Well, okay, let's drill down into that further. What age group are they? So whilst they might be of menopausal age, significant to note, but actually we've got a lot of younger workers, significant to note. At some point, the menopause is going to become an issue. And if that employer isn't kind of forward thinking, how are we going to respond to this? And that there's going to be trouble ahead.
As you say, it's not just about well-being. I mean, from the management side, or if you're an owner of a business, you don't want to lose your best people, do you?
Absolutely not. It's interesting, isn't it, with the cultural differences. In some cultures, you as a woman, you reach the menopause and you're seen as you've reached this pinnacle of life. You are now a wizened woman, and you're a pillar of the community. Whereas, unfortunately, in Western cultures, well, now you've reached a particular age, you've reached menopause, they'll stick you on your shelf and thanks very much, have done. And this isn't a permanent place where we are. This, it's just something we're going through, and there are so many ways that we can support individuals to stay in that job. Unfortunately, I know Diane touched on this earlier. I don't know if you'd mentioned the statistics. So 1 in 4 don't feel supported in work. 1 in 4 consider leaving. Actually, 1 in 10 women actually leave their job because of the menopause. Now, that is shocking when you think of all the skills and experience that walk out the window just because of that one particular period of life, when small changes can make the world of difference. So,
Are there any practical resources that you can recommend? I feel like the Welsh Government's quite supportive of this. Have you found that? And is there practical resources that people, if you're in a non-union environment, that concerns me slightly. If you work for a big employer that is non-unionised, what can people do? Is there any advice you can give them at all?
Absolutely. And the first one, join a union. Absolutely, join a union. I would say join Unison. I will say join Unison. But it's about having a voice, isn't it? I said about workplace policies and practices not being built with menopausal women in mind. But if we haven't got a voice and we're not at the negotiating table when we're talking about these things, we're not going to be able to make a difference. And the way you do that is becoming part of that voice, and unions provide that. So we're there to help negotiate the policies. We're there to help individuals and support them when they're having issues for their individual circumstances. There's lots of resources out there, and Unison has got a lot of resources, not just for kind of joining Unison, but information around the menopause and about how you can get more active within your union. So whether you're passionate around the menopause and actually having your voice heard around the menopause, around women's issues, or even becoming a rep like myself and Nev, it's about having your voice heard and being at that table where you can get your point across. Is so important. And you mentioned about Welsh Government. I mean, yes, they are supportive, and as Diane said, the Carolyn Harris's work around that has been sterling. We are very lucky, I think, in Wales, because obviously we've got free prescriptions in Wales, which great. That's so. Yeah, we can celebrate that in Wales. Unfortunately, England aren't so lucky. But as I say, Carolyn has made some really good steps towards that. I do completely agree with Diane that we definitely need to put more pressure on education for our GPs and for the kind of within medical schools. One of the things that always quite shocks me when I'm delivering training is that the number of people, I'll kind of go through symptoms, we'll have the conversation. Most people will talk about hot flushes. They forget about kind of all the symptoms that you mentioned earlier, Mel. I always ask them about their symptoms, and I always say, depending on your medical history, I'm not a medical professional. I very much come at the training from a trade union perspective. And I always say to people, look, depending on your medical background and your personal circumstances, speak to your GP. Inevitably, at that point, somebody will say that they've not had the best experience. And I think, Mel, Diane, I'm so glad that you did have a supportive experience with the GP. Unfortunately, as you said, that isn't always the case. And by no means am I putting a blanket across all GPs, but I do think it just highlights that actually, yes, as I said, we're making steps, but there's still so much further to go. We need that education so that it's a consistent approach right the way across the board.
Yeah, I want to know, Jenny, to be fair. I come up from a sporting angle, right? So if you've got the menopause or you've got periods, then obviously your energy levels and your your enthusiasm will be up different days or different weeks. So how long will it be before that employers will look at your, I suppose, your menstrual cycle and things like that, and whether you're going through the menopause, and adjust their goals and aims for you in the workplace based on them rather than based on what you normally do every day? Because you, at some stage, you're going to have to take that into account, aren't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you don't have that conversation, how do you know where to adjust those goals to?
Yeah, I just think it should be for everybody across the board, because everybody, I suppose, a body rhythm. You know, women are obviously got their menstrual cycle. Men will have morning and afternoons, whatever they are. So there'll be a time where you have to actually prioritise what their body rhythms are and how they work in the workplace to get the best out of your workforce. But we don't seem to do that. We just seem to say, right, you do that, you do that. And surely in the supervision there, you should have the chats in the supervision about reaching your goals, shouldn't you?
Absolutely.
Should probably be part of the sort of appraisal process, or the annual, or however many big conversations you have with your boss. Maybe not just, you know, your week to week stuff, those really big conversations. You talk about symptoms, exhaustion. Oh my goodness me. Again, I'm really lucky. I work from home quite a lot of the time post lockdown. So that exhaustion, sometimes in an office, you know, it could be 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's days when you literally feel, well, I literally feel like I could just close my eyes and go to sleep, honestly. And I think if you've got the adrenaline of an event, possibly something coming up, it might give you that lift that you need, but it might not. And the absolute exhaustion that you can feel, and then trying to, so again, if you're working in an environment where you're on a production line or something like that, where you cannot take your eye off the ball for a minute for that time you're working, or if you work in an environment where you're only allowed to take a very short break in the morning and a very short break in the afternoon, how do people cope with that? That's when employers are going to lose people, isn't it?
And it's interesting, you know, we talk about raising awareness for managers and understanding their responsibilities to our staff, but it's also about raising awareness generally, you know, for all of us, like Diane was saying earlier, and Nev, you touched on it earlier, about everybody recognises hot flushes as a symptom. You know, it's kind of the go-to. And I remember when the Wales TUC launched their toolkit, and I was reading through and we were looking at the symptoms, and dry skin, I've got that, aches and pains, I've got that, fatigue, I've got that. Now I'm very lucky that the symptoms that I experience are minimal. Many, varied, but minimal. And I dismissed it. And I think this is what a lot of people, perhaps with the kind of the less severe symptoms, will just dismiss, because you reach a particular, you know, you reach a certain age. I'm coming up to 50, I've got a young child, I'm going to feel tired. And if I partake in any kind of physical activity, whatever that may be, I'm going to ache because I'm a woman of a particular age. So I dismiss. And it wasn't until that I actually sat down and looked at the toolkit and thought, actually, I've probably got about 13 of those symptoms. Perhaps I am perimenopausal. I never thought about that. Now, if I've had that experience, I know from the training that I deliver, so many people are having that experience. So, you know, if people themselves don't recognize the symptoms, or perhaps recognize themselves that they're going through the menopause, how can they then have the conversation with other people? And it sometimes I think it's that recognition element as well.
So if there's one thing, I mean, we presume because of Neville's past sporting career and his Twitter feed, the thing we know about that, we presume we've got a more male than female audience. If there was one thing that you could say to men, Jenny, what would that be?
I would say, first of all, be part of the conversation. You know, it's no good to have your head buried in the sand. As a man, you're going to have females in your life that have either gone through, will go through, or are going through the menopause. So it's gone are the days where this was a taboo conversation, that this was, we don't talk about these issues. I remember having this conversation with my mum, and she was mortified at the thought, first of all, that I was delivering training, let alone delivering to a group of people and to men. I mean, she would never have brought up the issue with her dad, and she had a 2-minute conversation with her mum. I think let's bring that conversation to everybody. I think the trivializing, I think we recognize now that actually for all of us, not trivializing, recognizing the symptoms, being more aware, and actually taking responsibility to find out a little bit more, that this isn't just a women's issue, this is everybody's issue, and that's the only way we're going to make a change.
You know what I think? I think you and Diane should go and approach the Premier League, because we have Rainbow Laces Day, we have Show Races the Red Card Day. Why can't we have a Menopause Day and then do it through the women's football? I think that'd be a good one to do, because they should all be behind it, because, you know, especially now that there's more and more women going to the games as well. I think it'd be a good thing to do, especially now you've got women's football on television that are creating bigger audience than ever, but they never talk about it on there. They never talk about, you know, so and so's come off. Maybe she's in the middle of a period. Maybe she's finished. Maybe, you know, she's tired because of that. You know, they never talk about them issues. They talk about the sporting issues, but it's really their health is going to affect their performance. But I've never seen anything on a women's football about menopause.
What do you reckon,
Great
Diane?
idea. I love that idea.
Yeah.
Well, you've got an audience, haven't you? So why not? And the FA on the Premier League teams are going to have a bloody good excuse to turn it down.
I mean, and as you say, I mean, football is still quite a male-watched sport. I mean, I find that I'm a season ticket holder, and you know, there's a few women who sit around and about me, but not that many. But it is growing, and I know that there's football clubs doing lots of women's-based initiatives, providing free sanitary products in toilets, for example, has been very successful. The women's game is growing, but it's getting to that male audience. It's talking to men. It would be a great way to do it, to talk to men, because I think until men have a better understanding, I don't think men don't want to understand on the whole. I think men do want to understand it. We as women don't really understand. I spoke about one of my own experiences earlier. You know, we as women don't recognise the symptoms. Jenny said that, you know, until she looked at the toolkit, you didn't realise that you were experiencing that. I was putting my brain fog down to the fact that I think I might have had COVID, you know, when it first happened, because I had a very heavy cold. Don't know whether it was COVID or not. Oh, that must be what the brain fog is. It's only when you start to join the dots. If we can't do that as women, how do we expect men to be able to do that? For employers to be supportive, for our male colleagues at work to be supportive, if we need to take time off, if we just need a little bit of extra understanding, we just need to have the conversation, and things have improved massively. But I think, you know, Diana, I'm sure you would agree, we need to do more, don't we?
Oh, 100%, lovely. You know, and what you just said is, you know, it's so true. Whether you're going to experience it directly or indirectly at some point during your life, whether it's your partner, whether it's your mother, whether it's your sister, whether it's a friend, a colleague, etc., you are going to come across somebody going through menopause. And the thing is, the more educated we are, the more information we've got, the more supportive we can be, and hopefully the more compassionate we can be. And let's face it, in today's world, that cannot possibly be a bad thing.
So I'd like to ask the men in the room, in the virtual room, James, what do you feel you've learned today from listening to Diane and Jenny?
I mean, I've learned a great deal, and I feel that probably one of my big question would be, was something that Diane alluded to quite early on, where she talked about the role of her husband in this. He played an absolutely key role in what she went through. I'd be interested to get a sense from Diane about how he dealt with that at the time, like what resources were available to him, and you know, does he now talk about his experiences with other men? Because this is how, this is how a lot of learning is done. I mean, people talk and, they educate themselves around, relevant experiences. I'm just kind of, if Diane could maybe tell us a little bit about that, that'd be really interesting to me.
Yeah, so interestingly, James, we were both thrust into this situation at the same time. Neither of us, he'd been to those gynae appointments with me, so he knew that sort of counselling around what might happen, what all the symptoms could be. He knew that none of that had happened. So sort of when as I say, it was really my mental health, and when my mental health started to deteriorate, he didn't understand why. I didn't understand why. As I say, what was brilliant was he remained supportive throughout. So he was consistent throughout. He was, we hear people talk about their rock, don't we? And he really was. I mean, don't get me wrong, it wasn't easy. I was not an easy person to live with throughout that time. And I know that me waking up in a panic and then shaking the poor man awake at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I know how debilitating that became for him, because essentially he had to take over everything that we sort of did jointly. He had to take over, as well as going to work as well. So it was really trying. But as you say, the point where he stopped asking me about going back to the doctors and then stepped in, that made a huge difference. And he has indeed, bless him, spoken about it since. He's spoken about it on national radio. He's spoken about it on national TV, because I've never forced him to, but I have asked him if he would, because I think it's really important that we hear more male voices around this subject, whether it's supporting their partners or whether it's, around what Jenny was talking about, sort of raising awareness in the workplace. And everybody that we know knows what I went through, and our more wider connections through social media clearly all know. But he will regularly, I posted something a couple of days that he then shared out to all of his contacts on social media. So I think, it's a ripple effect, isn't it? If I always say to everybody that I speak to, whether it's to an audience of 100 or to one person, please share what you've learned. Please go and have a conversation, because even if it's only with one person, you will have helped to educate that one person, and who knows how important that could be. And I think it's really vital that I think that's what's so brilliant. And thank you, Nev, for inviting, because I think that's what's so brilliant about this is kind of for your audience, this could potentially change an awful lot of lives.
Right, so I'll upset you again now, shall I? Because you know what struck me?
You can try, lovely.
You know what struck me as you're talking now? If you haven't got that, I suppose, diagnosis, and I'm thinking of all women on the front line in the army. I'm thinking of all firearms officers who are women, and I'm thinking of all paramedics and everybody who are women. And if you haven't got that diagnosis, they're setting you up to fail, and that worries me to death.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and that should be the forefront of everything, I think, is how quickly you can get a diagnosis, I suppose. And and
it's a really good point, Nev, because sort of over 70% of the NHS staff are women. A huge number of them are women over the age of 40. And just anecdotally, just me and the women that I see and speak to and counsel over the last few years, I have lost count of the amount of them who were nurses or healthcare professionals in some way, shape or form who have walked away from their jobs because they didn't feel support. Either they didn't understand what was going on for them, or they didn't feel supported. And, we cannot afford to lose these people. We can't afford to lose nurses, police officers, etc., etc. So, it is imperative that this information, education and support gets out there sooner rather than later.
Yeah, no, for me, it's been absolutely brilliant listening to both of you, because there's obviously, the stuff I have no idea about really. But there's a lot of things I do understand. But like I say, I think it's just getting it in front of people, so it becomes nice and easy to talk about. And in the past, I do think because it was a male-dominated society, that made it twice as hard. Now I think things are softening. And also, there's more female bosses now, so hopefully they'll have a little bit more empathy for their workers, female workers. So I do think the world's changing that way. Plus, the internet's come along, which makes it easier. But also, the only problem with the internet is where you get the right information. And I suppose signposting to the truth is that. And then it's really, I suppose, all about a lottery for your GP. If your GP is good, you've got a good chance. If it's not, then I think you have to go and get a second opinion.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And there's, talking about information, there's some really good sources of information out there now. So we have the British Menopause Society in the UK, and there's a patient arm of that, which is called Women's Health Concern. And then for those going through an early menopause, there's a fantastic charity called the Daisy Network. So there's some really good sources of factual, evidence-based information that can be relied on.
And I think with Jenny, I think if there's ever a time to join a union, it's the time to join a union when you're a female, because sometimes you need that in-between person to go and speak to your boss. So sometimes you can't go and speak to your boss on some subjects, maybe because he is a man, or maybe because you feel intimidated because he is your boss. But if you have that in-between person, that rep, who can go in and state your case, then I think you really should join a union. Should you, Jenny?
I couldn't agree more, Nev. The whole point of trade unions is it's not just you stood on your own, it's you with your trade union rep and the whole power of your workforce behind you. That's the whole ethos. And if we can make a change and make a strength to women's rights, then all power to it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, guys.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
So big thank you today to Jenny Griffin and Diane Danzebrink, our guests. A thank you to Mel Harvey, whose brainchild this episode was. A big thank you to Neville Southall, the man who launched this podcast series. I'm James Rogers, I'm your host. Thank you so much for listening to us today. We'll be back again soon.